Before I begin with some of the seminal ideas of Freud, firstly, as a very formal note, I would like to thank the West Bengal State University for inviting me to speak in this honorable platform on a discourse on psychoanalysis, which is very close to my heart, and absolutely overwhelming to see that Calcutta responds to psychoanalysis in this way. Really very happy to see this, and I think that entire credit goes to Dr. Srimoy to initiate this, the drive in it, and of course to the entire team of students and colleagues who've been working together for the success of these two-day seminar. Well, I've been told by Srimoy that I have to look into some of the seminal ideas of Freud, and tomorrow I'll be looking at some of the contemporary developments post-Freud. In the morning we heard Pushpadi talk on exactly these areas, and as a matter of fact, I was telling Pushpadi outside that I would be very happy if I could get Chuti and just sit there, and the next 2 days Pushpadi can teach us. It'll be lovely, because she did cover almost everything that possibly I may have to say. But in spite of that, unfortunately, I am under order by Srimoy, and thus you are under compulsion to a certain extent. You have the freedom, I don't have the freedom. We will talk about freedoms of the analyst and the analyzed, and also later on in this lecture. So at this point, it seems like you can be the analyzer and have the freedom to act out, though I can only request, I'll be delighted if you are with me in the next 1.5 hours. All right, so today what I'm going to try and do is share my understanding and thoughts on what I have learned about Freud's seminal ideas, my understanding of seminal ideas. It's impossible to talk about Freud's every single seminal idea, which later on gave birth to the post-Freudian developments in one lecture. I mean, we learn these things over years. And I know that it is extremely boring to listen to a theoretical lecture for, I mean, we had 1 hour in the morning, and now another 1.5 hours. So I'm going to try and do something which actually the discipline itself talks about, and Freud talks about, is you do something well only when you enjoy it. So I'm going to try and talk about Freud the way I enjoy Freud, so that at least between the two of us, one of us enjoys, and I'm hoping, against all hope, that you would enjoy to a certain extent. To come back to pleasure, yes. So I'm going to try and make it as pleasurable as possible for me and as for you. And I'm going to talk about the pathway of the psychoanalytic theoretical developments in the form of a goppo, if it's possible. The goppo of Freud, the story of Freud, the narrative of Freud. As I believe strongly that every creator, every discovery has somewhat of a biographical reference. And I would like to begin with a little bit of biographical references that we may find in Freud's theoretical developments and his life at another level. Sigismund Shlomo Freud, that was his full name, which I hardly remember. It's always Sigmund Freud. And yes, over 83 years, which means he witnessed both the wars, most importantly, because that would be influencing at least the latter half of his writings very strongly. And as my today's lecture would be let's say the platform for tomorrow's post-Freudian developments, because we'll be ending with how he was moving towards from the drive theory towards the development of the ego, and the focus coming more and more towards ego. Yes, psychoanalysis can't do without parents. We cannot do without Freud's parents. Amalia and Jacob Freud. Very important to notice, Bertha Freud was it was his father's second marriage. I'm usually not interested in personal matters, but the reason I pointed out that it was his second marriage is because he already had, when he came into life, he already had two older half-brothers and 6 younger siblings. And I think that is a handful for an infant to deal with. And mother who was 20 years younger than Freud's father, Jacob himself. So in that sense, he was closer to his, chronologically closer to his mother than to his father. And the story goes like, Freud was the favorite of his mother, and apparently one of his siblings was excellent in playing the piano. Freud was always a very studious person. It was only later that we see Freud more going into the arts, discovering music, literature, and indulging himself into the aesthetics of the arts. In his initial period, when he was growing up, he had a brother who used to play the piano. And very interestingly, we would find that sibling rivalry was very much there in him as well, because he complained profusely to his mother about the piano, because it was very disturbing and he couldn't study, to the extent not only was the sibling forced to stop playing, the piano vanished from the house. So it's a very, very interesting beginning for our dear Freud, who's going to try and read all of these human emotions. I think one of the fascinating aspects of Freud, one of the most moving aspects of Freud that I find is that even when he is looking at sorrow, human tears, he is trying to study the tear. So we would find that he was trying to study his tears in the later years, in the 1920s, when he would be facing with the death of his daughter. This is not very uniquely Freud, that when devastation of life comes and challenges you, that you try to find greater findings of life from that. We've seen that in Tagore as well, when we saw him losing his son. Anyway, so as the story continues, his father had to move town in 1857 because of the economic crisis, which was pre-war condition coming into Europe. And finally they settled into Vienna, where he lived till the last day, not the last day, till almost the end of his life, just leaving a couple of years when he moved to London because of the Second World War getting there and him being under threat by the Nazi government. Most of us in this room are aware of some of the cornerstones that I would be touching, but it's impossible to talk about the gradual development if I don't touch upon at least the cornerstones in the development of Freud and his work. Yes, we can't do without the two names, Breuer and Charcot, the two who gave psychoanalysis a kind of, let's say, platform, a base to look into, let's say, the mental agony of human existence. We find, under Breuer, you would find that I've written catharsis, and with Charcot, hypnosis. Breuer, I've written catharsis because Breuer and Freud will be working very soon, which we'll find in the next couple of slides. We'll be working very soon on a joint case, Anna O. We would be looking at the significance of patience in the development of this discipline itself, which Anna O had a huge contribution to make. So catharsis, because this leads to the direct need for people to vent out one's emotions, one's conflicts, one's desires, to be able to have the freedom to articulate without being judged, without being repressed, to be able to provide that time and space for that individual to articulate that. Of course, it didn't happen so smoothly. It didn't happen just like that overnight. As we know that Anna O was with Breuer for quite some time, till Breuer got into discussion with Freud, and then Freud took over Anna O. This is a very, very classic picture of how mental health at that point was looked upon, especially neurosis. We were looking at neurosis and hysteria. The lady, as you can see, is this is from the hospital Salpêtrière, where Freud worked with Charcot. Charcot was working there, and the gentleman on the right of the lady is Charcot himself. And this is how it was. The training used to happen. Is to, the woman would go into a hysterical fit, and then they would talk about how you can work through it and what are the the prognostic developments and all of that, the treatment procedure, which of course is not how it is at the moment. But this is where we started off from, and the stigma of neurosis with women unfortunately still runs today. With psychology, psycho, all kinds of stigma that women have to bear with. I mean, it is also, while it's overwhelming and fantastic to see so much of young people interested in psychoanalysis, it is a little disheartening to find not enough men complimenting women in the room itself. So hopefully we will have more men wanting to study neurosis and mental health than just women, because it's not something which is a monopoly of women. Anna O, Bertha Pappenheim. I wanted to have a slide on Anna O because I would like to acknowledge the discipline's indebtedness to the patients. Because Anna O is the person who used the term talking cure in ways of addressing. So the talking cure was the first term before we came into gradually developing into psychoanalysis, and the talking cure was exactly what was happening in the session, that they were just talking. She was just talking about it. And also I wanted to bring about that, let's say, unlike to the general idea, neurotic women are, I don't know, the idea of, feigned, the idea of the associations that they are not intelligent, etc. It wasn't like that. We had Freud treating women who were extremely intelligent. As a matter of fact, Anna O herself, who was the founder of the League of Jewish Women in that period. So I would consider that, as a woman of 21st century, I would consider that to be a pioneering step for a woman of that time, to start a League of Jewish Women, when very soon we would be moving to a time when she's still alive, where Jews as an entire culture would be, as a species, would be under threat of existence. Yes, on one hand we have hysteria as a symptom, which, I mean, I wouldn't go into talking about hysteria as a symptom at this, the depth of it, but it's interesting how hysteria is a symptom and hypnosis or talking cure, how it works. I would like to relate a little bit to my understanding of the little that I've read of the core of hysteria. Hysteria, the moment we say hysteria, we think of dramatic performances, in the sense, dramatization of love, dramatization of sorrow. It's like a performance, very, very prolonged play. It's like a story, a narrative gets narrated, and with hysteria, it is a narrative in the head of the individual, and thus the need to perform, because I am narrating the story in front of the audience, and I need to charm the audience, attract the audience. So that's, there's a narrative, there's an oral need to, a narrative which gets constructed by orality. But if we relate this to the talking cure, is this narrative could be penetrated only through another, let's say, oral tradition, which was termed the talking cure. So it wasn't quite a surprise. It may not have been articulated in so many clear terms by Freud at that time, but when we relook at it, it is very natural that hypnosis, hysteria should find the talking cure as its means of trying to come out of it. But the talking cure which was not in a conscious state. As we know, the hypnotic state is not a conscious state. So we are talking about a talking cure opening up with repressed aspects of our mind and desire, using a somewhat monitored, controlled process of hypnosis, which of course would be challenged over time by Freud himself. I think that I find very phenomenal about Freud is that this is one person who's written and talked about theories which he had the courage to reject in his own lifetime. And I think that's wonderful as a quality, as a genius, as a creator, to go beyond oneself repeatedly. We find the word psychoanalysis coming in print for the first time in 1896 when we find the work in Hysteria with Freud coming out. And gradually, as we can see, that psychoanalysis, from the study of neurology, we are moving into the study of psychoanalysis and the use of language changing. Psychoanalysis is a pathway of the conscious becoming aware of the unconscious. So here, a quick look at what we are looking at, what Freud is looking at, the unconscious. What is the unconscious? What is the bed of the unconscious for Freud? Most importantly, the bed of the unconscious for Freud is fantasy. Fantasy. Now, I would like to elaborate a little on fantasy. Fantasy is a state of mind of an infant child during the early stages of development. It's not just imagination. As a matter of fact, it's important for us to understand the concept of fantasy, because based on the concept of fantasy would be the later development of object relationship. And thus they would be talking about this fantasy is, as you can see, I've written the next line, the infant makes sense of the external world through introjection and projection. So there is a constant dialogue happening in the infant's mind. And based on this dialogue, the infant creates the pattern of relationships, which will actually become the focus of the object relationship much later, which I'm not going to be touching today, but we would be looking at tomorrow. So in a way, I'm trying to create my base for tomorrow's as well. And thus you would by now probably have guessed that I'm not going to say that, there is, I don't know, Freud is irrelevant or out of vogue. I'm not a person of that, or that contemporary theories have rejected Freud. I'm not going to be somebody of that, but I'm going to try and posit myself, my theories, in a way to show that Freud actually created the base for the future developments. Not all of them, but a whole lot of them. And we'll be able to identify them. The exact articulation which happens post-Freud may not be found in Freud's language itself, but we'll be able to probably identify the seminal ideas, as my topic is about the seminal ideas of Freud. Yes, so this is the role of fantasy. So as Freud said, the unconscious is full of fantasy. So this unconscious, before language comes into play for the child, fantasy starts taking place. And with that, what we mean by childhood amnesia is primarily this fantasy which is repressed. So this is something that is in complete childhood amnesia, which is not possible to recollect, remember. It may be possible to recreate through association. And that's exactly what psychoanalysis does in its process of treatment. 1905, the 3 essays on sexuality. Here I have to share a story that my analyst shared with us when he was teaching us Freud's theories of sexuality. And we were talking about infantile sexuality. Of course, he did something blasphemous. One is that one is talking about sexuality. 2 is that one is talking about infantile sexuality. That's absolutely blasphemous. How can one? Here, I would like to say something. Sexuality, yes, as most of you over in this session, in this room, know, sexuality is not what we are talking about, genitality. Sexuality has 2 major elements of eros and erotica. So when we are talking about sexuality of the child, we are talking about, let's say when we are talking about, before I come to the child, when we are talking about sexuality per se of an adult, we are talking both of the eros and the erotica. Very briefly, the eros would be the romantic aspect where when we are in love, we love to hold hands, look at the sky, walk for hours, write poems for each other. And the erotica is when we experience writing poems, walking for hours is not enough and we need to pounce on each other. Okay, that's not really exactly how it happens, but as I said, I'm going to try and make it a little more pleasurable for us so that we learn theories and we enjoy them and we feel comfortable enough to see that it happens in us. If theories are too theoretical and too I would say academic, we feel, oh, it happens to them, it doesn't happen to us. But that's the first step that Freud started off with. All of this happens to us. Infantile sexuality is all you and me, and that's Freud too, and everything else. So when we talk about sexuality for the adult, this is how we would look. When we talk about sexuality in terms of the infant, there is a major role of the eros. The eros is the innumerable ways that the child plays. The erotica is much more specific. The breast, the bathing, where the bodily contact is there. The eros is the mother playing with the child, the lullabies, the child looking around, playing around, interacting. Eros is, let's say, the child playing with other children or with adults. All of this, because it creates, it's not because the child is yearning, but it creates narratives in the child's mind. It creates the object relation that we were talking about, the fantasy. So fantasy has to have certain reality, and then it's free, it's so creative, it imagines and makes a whole story out of it. The hysteric personality is not really as we tend to think. Most of us don't have much of empathy for hysterics because we say, oh, it's all put on, it's all a show, puro dekhache, nautanki, showbazi and all of that. It's not that, it's a story. It's their capacity to create. It's a different matter that the intention of it changes. With the child, it's exactly the same. At that time, there is no censorship, so the child has the absolute freedom to create that fantasy. All of that creates eros. And now we will also be able to understand why, even when we are mature adults, when we are in the role of sexuality and we are experiencing erotica in full-fledged adult manner, it is not enough to have erotica. It has to be complemented duly with eros. Otherwise, the sex workers of the world would be the happiest people. So we need to understand sex has its tremendous limitation. And this is also where, these are all, I would say, once again, seminal ideas. He couldn't go into all this detail. As you can understand by now, that I deeply love Freud. So I have to constantly keep defending him. That he was one little gentleman, he was actually short also, one little gentleman, he couldn't have said it all and done it all. He just gave seminal ideas for us to evolve. I mean, otherwise what would you and I do? I wouldn't be here anyway. So coming back to the infantile sexuality. So this eros finds a different language when we're treating children. We try to understand children through their role of eros, the eros which is embedded, weaved in their games, in their plays. That's why play therapy is so important for children. When we come to, I wouldn't get a chance so much to go into detail of it, but tomorrow we'll be touching upon Anna Freud, where a lot has been, I mean, she worked with children primarily, and she developed child therapy, if one looks at as a categorical psychoanalytic development post-Freud. She developed the child therapy. Of course, Melanie Klein is there, but it is considered in the analytic world in that way. And she talks about play therapy extensively, and all of this comes from there, from that fantasy. And that fantasy happened because of the eros. Overstimulation gets difficult. We will not go into the clinical aspects of it. Freud's seduction theory. So as we can see, that infantile sexuality means basically that I am talking about the entire person infant, and both her eros and her erotica. Erotica which hasn't found the genital expression of physical language, but erotica which has found different other ways of physical expressions. Closeness, physical proximity, closeness, the mother's breast, bathing, playing around, being in the physical proximity of the caretaker. So all of this is part of the erotica for the child. Repressed memories always talk about seduction, various layers of play narratives. This seduction, once again, we need to clarify our mindset, is this seduction is not about sexual seduction, not about sexual here, genital seduction, that I want you to be in a romantic relationship. This seduction could be a knife play. All of us must have seen how children have this tremendous capacity to make us laugh. They do something naughty and they wait and they look around like this and they see if I'm smiling and they know they've got it. That's seduction for them. It's not the same seduction. There is an innocence in that seduction, which we will be able to find in hysteric personality. There is always an innocence in their seduction, because their narrative is stuck in the mother-child narrative, the earliest of the fantasy. The reason I'm talking about hysteria and repression, because these two, repression primarily also, is a very fundamental defense mechanism. And hysteria is something, once again, all of us have the potential of becoming, like almost all the pathologies, we all have the potential. But hysteria is very, very seductive, because we love this play. We create our own stories. So we want to stay in that narrative of the mother and the child, the caretaker and the child, the dyad, the mother-child dyad. Of course, what over time that Freud comes to conclusion is that the seduction scenes were fantasy, were certain, once again, coming from my narratives that I create. Fantasies are not equivalent to lies. They are not lies. My projection introjection has been in such a way, and it is so much engraved in my unconscious, in my psyche, that it becomes my one and only authentic narrative pattern. And I try to get into a relationship with that narrative pattern repeatedly, whether it's with my friends, whether it's with my any close relationship, with my parents, with my lovers, later on with my analyst as well. So this is, once again, something that needed to be clarified by Freud, that initially he thought there were real stories of seduction, and there was the father abusing the child or some male member abusing the child. But with his work, he discovers that this is primarily the fantasy expressing, the child's fantasy, which they believe to be real. Most important for us clinicians, practitioners to keep in mind. I'm not going to go into the detail of this. I'm absolutely sure all of you are aware of the topographical and structural model. What I would like to go from here is the need to create the structural model. By the 1920s, Freud is, when we look at his works, we'll be seeing that gradually he's getting into an engagement more with understanding deeper layers. I wouldn't say that he was rejecting his ideas, but he could possibly see the conscious, pre-conscious, the unconscious division were not enough to talk about who decides what thoughts will go to my unconscious, pre-conscious, or to my conscious. So there has to be an agent who is powerful enough to decide that. And thus we can see that the thrust or the need to search for the ego can be somewhere located in this itself, and thus the structural development from there, the ego, superego, and the id. More trying to understand the self in terms of the world. So as we were discussing with Preetha ma'am also outside a while back, that Freud perhaps may not have had the articulations of the object relations theories, that clarity, but we'll be able to find the seminal seeds in his thoughts. What was driving him? It was no longer just the drives. It was no longer just pleasure. There was something much more complex coming into the scene, which was moving, pushing us towards the ego. This is just to give us a clarity, as most of you already know, that unlike what we would like to believe, that most of the time we are in a conscious state, most of the time we are in our unconscious state. So the unconscious is far more overpowering and ruling than the little level of conscious state that we have. As a matter of fact, as Freud kept saying, that our conscious self, our conscious behavior, all of this, our conscious choices, all of this actually gets determined by our unconscious wishes, by our unconscious. So thus, it is very, very important to understand what happens in the unconscious. Not that I know any better, but I'm intrigued and I'm kicked by the fact that he alone was trying to figure out all of this and dwell into a world where none dared to. And we read about his own self-analysis where he would be locking up his room for 5 years and doing self-analysis. So his entire family thought he would be going insane. And people who go through analysis, full-fledged analysis, there's just this thin line between sanity and insanity, between neurosis and psychosis. We are just on that borderline. So it's actually quite scary to go into analysis. We might be fascinated by psychoanalysis, but the journey, the pathway of psychoanalysis is extremely challenging. This is a very basic mental conflict that we all, once again, as you can see, my presentation today will all be touching upon very, very basic areas. So the ego versus id, which is very clear to all of us, which gives us the neurotic anxiety. Id as the reservoir of all our desires. But as we have seen in the previous slide, that it is not only the reservoir of all our desires, it is also the reservoir of all our irrational thoughts. This irrational thoughts would also perhaps be making space of the fantasy, which is in an amnesia, but exists. Could be an amnesia, but exists. And I have as an individual, I have the capacity to unlock that unconscious, and I will not get the exact, let's say, fantasy material, but I'll be able to recreate my fantasy based on that material which is stored up in my unconscious reservoir, in my id. Ego versus external reality, yes, of course. Realistic anxiety, moral anxiety. I'm sure absolutely all of us have experienced moral anxiety when we are in our teens and we come back late at night smelling of such colorful liquid that we are not supposed to. I'm sure that is a very tiny moral anxiety that we've gone through, and I'm absolutely sure you're capable of more acute moral anxiety. All the best for that. Realistic anxiety, yes, of course. Before I came here, there has been realistic anxiety. As a matter of fact, while speaking, you overcome that. I think other than the Indian Psychoanalytical Society, in Calcutta, this is the first time that I'm talking on psychoanalysis in this platform, which once again I appreciate, and I'm thankful to Srimoyi on that for offering me this. I've had the opportunity to talk about psychoanalysis outside Calcutta in different parts of India, primarily Bangalore and Delhi, and outside of India as well. But I think what I went through was a realistic anxiety, because I wish Pushpati was here. Pushpati has even taught me. So it's never comfortable to talk in front of your teachers and your principals and your parents. You always feel that you're being judged and weighed, though I'm sure, at least I hope, we analysts are liberated of judgment. Okay, 1900, another phenomenal discovery. 1905 with the infantile sexuality, the story that I wanted to say. Please pardon me, it's like if it's an adda, you will allow me a little to and fro. 1905 when infantile sexuality happened, and as my analyst was telling me the story, telling us the story, is that apparently when Freud was ready to give the lecture at the University of Vienna, there was nobody in the hall, and there was one young gentleman sitting there who happened to be the son of one of Freud's friends, who was forced by his father to be there just because, you know, some cordiality, some honor. The most interesting part is that in an empty hall with just one audience, Freud did give the lecture on infantile sexuality of 2 hours in the University of Vienna. It wasn't easy, as we will see that later on in his life also, the test that he went through wasn't easy. I've always wondered, why is it that this man never smiles in his photograph? What is his problem in life? Honestly, he is an extremely handsome man, but he always looks angry and pissed off with the world. Well, yes, he's gone through a lot in life and he's always thinking, but I still don't find any reason why he should be like that. But I guess I would give him the benefit of doubt as much as I give the benefit of doubt to my dear old Tagore. Tagore is another person that I keep thinking, Arey, why doesn't he smile? He makes us smile, he makes us sway, much like Freud. But perhaps that's the irony: if you make the other smile and sway, your smile and your swaying perhaps needs to stay with yourself. That's probably what psychoanalysis would be talking about when we talk about neutrality. Neutrality doesn't mean that I am cold, that I am without emotions. It's just that this is not the time and place. The analytic space and time is not the time and place for me to express my feelings. I am as potent in feelings as you are, but I must learn to use it in discretion, with discretion. And the analytic space and time is yours, the analysans, not the analysts. And hence, I step back. That's all. That's neutrality for me. 1900, the interpretation of dreams. Yes, another phenomenal discovery in the pathway of psychoanalytic development. Dreams, in a straightforward manner, are wish fulfillment. As a matter of fact, if you allow me, Srimoyi, can I tell the audience that there's a dream workshop happening? Okay, if you can go to Christ University in Bangalore, on the 18th of March, there's a dream workshop happening, co-chaired by Dr. Sudhir Karkar, of course, and fortunately, unfortunately, me as well. Okay, now coming back to it. Adda machi ekটু freedom নিলাম। চা হলে জমে যেত, যাই হোক। Dreams as wish fulfillment. Most of us would know that that's a direct understanding of dreams, but what happens when we are repeatedly seeing, I'm of course not going to go into analyzing dreams or going into the depth of understanding it at this point, but even when we are dreaming of unpleasant things, nightmares, dreams where we are falling, all of that, that also has something to do with my wish fulfillment. That wish fulfillment may not be a straightforward, direct pleasure. For example, I dream that Prince Charles comes with his white horse and lifts me up, and I'm in the sky. Woo, I don't want to wake up. That's a straightforward wish fulfillment. But if I have to dream that, yes, I am giving this lecture and everybody is throwing stones at me, and you know, I have a black face, and you write around town what a horrible etc talk etc has been. There also is a certain wish fulfillment, which is not a direct pleasure, an indirect pleasure. Pleasure needs to be understood not as fun and frolic, but a complex structure. So, what is the pleasure? Is the pleasure somewhere from the fantasy of being denigrated, used to that? A lot of the times we can't handle success because we are so used to, oh, I am so shitty. When the reward really comes, I'm like, no, this can't happen to me. Hoyni, oh, bhul hoyeche. Complete denial. Because now I cannot be in that comfort zone. Now I cannot be the eternal victim. Now I have to stop counter-aggressing you and actually appreciate you and get into a dialogue with you, because you're giving me the opportunity. You're not actually stoning me. You're appreciating me. So I can't think of you as horrible human beings. I have to think of you as wonderful human beings who can appreciate, which means it's demanding so much from me. So we have to understand how dreams play, why we dream of nightmares. As Freud repeatedly told us that our unconscious determines our conscious acts. Our unconscious, where does the dream material come from? It comes basically from the reservoir, which is the unconscious, and the site of dreams is at the preconscious. So it's unconscious, preconscious, conscious. The site of the dream is at the preconscious. So it takes material from the unconscious, but it is tickled by the conscious. Something that I see or experience in the conscious, but possibly staying in my subliminal state. I'm not so much aware of it. And then something starts happening in my preconscious, wanting to become conscious, preconscious, in the state of wanting to become conscious. So even when I am dreaming of something which is disturbing me, which is pleasant as well as disturbing, somewhere the mechanism of the dream itself helps my conscious state to be less disturbing. Had they erupted, and I'm not sure if it's erupted or erupt, okay. Erupt, thank you. Had they erupt, maybe my conscious state wouldn't have been so much at peace. It is actually very caring. Dreams and the entire mechanism of dreams is very caring. It wants to help us. It wants to help the conscious state without making us feel overt about it. So it happens at a time when I'm in a semi-conscious state, when I'm in my sleepy state, when my faculties are not sharp and aware, where it, with my willy-nilly participation, I'm there and yet I'm not there, it tries to sort things out. It allows me to be a little lazy. I don't have to have that constant awareness of working out something which is so disturbing me. I'm not being able to fathom out. So it works out, it takes care of me. It works out when I'm in semi-conscious state, when I'm sleeping, and settles things for me. And when I wake up, momentarily I might, if it's a nightmare, I might be disturbed. But it doesn't necessarily stay too long. Of course, if I am repeatedly dreaming of something, then which means it's a deeper conflict to which perhaps my unconscious is trying to work it through and not finding a solution. It's trying to repeatedly work it through, which means perhaps I need to help the unconscious a little bit. The human mechanism is absolutely phenomenal, the way I understand, the way perhaps Freud has shared. Parapraxis, jokes, Freudian slip. Preconscious is a very important state for us. For example, I'm absolutely sure all of us go through these parapraxis. If you had to take this, slip of tongue right now, I'm sure with my association something will come out. But to give an example, let's say Freudian slip. Let's say I'm about to say that I'm deeply honored to be invited here, but I land up saying I'm deeply cornered to be invited here. So that's my inner state coming out. And this is sometimes required because this is how life goes on. None of us are perfect. Understanding psychoanalysis, understanding oneself is all the more difficult because you will understand that we always have the potential of becoming from neurotic to psychotic. As we say, we are all happily neurotics here, and we are all potential psychotics. Jokes, yes, couldn't have been a greater creation of Bengali culture, of food and bowels, other than piku. I mean, we all laugh at it, but there are very few Bengali middle-class families who don't talk about bowels in their dinner table, which was most wonderfully shown. Of course, a lot of people has taken that to great objection. That's a different matter. I'm not going to get into that argument. But yes, jokes help us. We know the innumerable jokes that help us to take care of our counter-aggression against each other. Otherwise, we'll not be able to stay alive. The fact is that we can't really erase of aggression. How can we find different modes of expression of aggression which does not erase the other? It is a basic instinct, so we'll have to deal with it. I'm definitely not going to go into the detail of it. Most of you know it better than me. The reason I wanted this is because, once again, it was a seminal I would say, idea of Freud's, because based on this it would be developing not only later on Erikson's psychosocial, this is psychosexual, he'll be developing the psychosocial model. Not only that, the entire defense mechanism structure, Freud did a little bit, Anna Freud would be extending a lot more. When we are looking at, tomorrow we'll get a chance to see a little more of Anna Freud's defense mechanism. Because the defense mechanism is a direct activity of the ego. And this couldn't have been possible without the seminal idea. That was one point. The other point is because I would like to draw our attention to the mid-level, the most important level, the phallic stage. The phallic stage where the Oedipus complex develops. I suppose most of us are aware of the Oedipus story, right? Most of us. I'll just quickly touch upon. I love the Oedipus Rex. Oedipus Rex as in by Sophocles, the Greek tragic writer. Basically, as most of us are aware, the story is that King Oedipus, before he became King Oedipus, he was rejected by his parents, by his mother, because there was a prophecy by Tiresias, the blind seer, who said that this son shall grow up to kill his father and marry his mother and beget children with his mother. So this is the reason he was rejected by his parents. The mother wanted to kill the child but didn't have the heart, so finally kind of left the child astray, who was picked up later on, etc., etc. And through destiny, unfortunately, once again, Oedipus came back to Queen Jocasta, that was the name of his mother, who would become his wife, after killing King Laius. This is the story of Sophocles, Oedipus by Sophocles. As a matter of fact, if we ever get a chance, I would really, maybe Srimoy can have that in mind, of the students, please watch Pasolini's Oedipus Rex. It's a wonderful mythological narrative structurization based on this, which talks about the mother-son dyad and you will see the romance in it so wonderfully depicted, which will help us to further understand the fantasy and to understand what we meant by the play narratives, or the eros, the narratives of the eros for the child. The reason I wanted to touch upon Oedipus complex is because this was the time, in 1897, as you can see, Freud writes to Fliess that he comes across the elements of the Oedipus complex, love for one parent and jealous hostility towards the other. This discovery was more than incidental to the theory of dreams, since it vividly illustrates the infantile roots of the unconscious wishes animating all dreams. It's a phenomenal statement. All dreams are dreams are the first and the most important pathway to the unconscious, symbolic pathway to the unconscious. Dreams come from this transaction, this dialogue of the Oedipus, which is the dyad, the mother-child dyad. Here, of course, one of the other reasons that I wanted to bring upon the Oedipus, touch upon the Oedipus complex, is because when Freud was writing about the mother-child dyad, he was primarily writing about the mother-son dyad. Tomorrow we'll be looking at the pre-Oedipal state, the mother-child dyad, which becomes the post-Freudian emphasis in a very, very significant manner. As a matter of fact, the pre-Oedipal significance has shifted the entire focus of the locus of psychoanalysis from the father to the mother. And as a matter of fact, the Japanese psychoanalytic thoughts, I particularly mention Japanese psychoanalytic theories because I've had the opportunity to study them to a certain extent. To a certain extent, the pre-Oedipal attachment was also talked upon by our father of psychoanalysis, Girindra Shekhar Bose. As a matter of fact, Girindra Shekhar Bose and Heizaku Kesawa from Japan, both of them had written to Freud about the pre-Oedipal attachment. The Oedipal is when the father comes into the picture. The pre-Oedipal is a mother-child dyad. For whatever reasons, it didn't find a hearing at that time with Freud. Now, there could be possibilities and possibilities for that, but there are two possibilities that I would like to cite. One is, of course, like every other discipline, psychoanalysis also has the politics of academics and theories and all of that. That could be one. The other, let us not forget, the roots of Freud himself, his closeness to his mother, and his distance from his father. In his writings, we see him elaborately talking about his father, who was hardly there, and his mother, who apparently was very close to him, has never been talked about. So, things for us to think. Naturally, from the Oedipus complex would come the castration complex. Once again, it happens in the phallic stage itself. The castration complex, a fear of emasculation, manhood is questioned, male virility is humiliated. It's not necessarily that the penis is castrated, cut off, but where I experience my male virility being humiliated. And this is exactly what happened to the myth of Oedipus. His male virility was humiliated. Why did he pierce his eyes? Because he saw something that he was not meant to see. He saw the naked body of his mother as a sexual object. This was not meant for him to see. So, his entire existence, very interesting that he did not die. Jocasta kills herself, but Oedipus doesn't kill himself. He dags his eyes and lives through the suffering, and that's the tragedy. The tragedy is not the end of it. The tragedy is the living through the guilt and the agony and the desire where the last time that he sees Yocasta, the desire of touching the wife, the love that he loved so dearly, that made love to so dearly, and the gross feeling and the horror of what I have done to my mother. It's just absolutely, I have no words to explain. It's just phenomenal the way this myth. And thus he castrates himself, something that he lives with till the last day of his life. Child's fear of damage being done to their genitalia by the parent of the same sex, as punishment for sexual feelings toward the parent of the opposite sex. Once again, sexual feeling, if we have to extend it to the clinical situation, sexual feeling does not necessarily here talking about gentle feeling. Let us not confuse about the story Oedipus Rex and the Oedipus situation that we are talking about in psychoanalysis. All of us are part of the Oedipus Oedipal triangle, as much as part of the pre-Oedipal diet. Of course, it's a different debate. If we get a chance, we'll talk about the pre-Oedipal diet, what happens to it, and the Oedipal triangle. Castration anxiety, once again, I wanted to touch upon, because much like happened with the Oedipus complex, with post-Freudian theoretical developments, when the focus has come to the pre-Oedipal diet, thereby changing the locus of psychoanalysis from the bedrock of the triangle, the father, to the diet, to the mother. Castration was believed with the Oedipal classical psychoanalysis, was believed that did not happen with women. With post-Freudian psychoanalytic developments, castration is something that also happens to women, because it is not about an organ. It is about certain ideas, certain fantasies. Both have two different complexities, which perhaps is not possible to discuss at length now, but can just touch upon. Yes, the defense mechanism, I'm not going to go through it. All of you know it once again much better than me. I'm sure you have to write it for your exams. The most important, repression. This is Freud's defense mechanism. I wanted to use it as a reference because we'll be looking at some of the defense mechanisms of Anna Freud in terms of the ego tomorrow. Repression is the most fundamental form of defense mechanism, where childhood amnesia happens, and sublimation as one of the most mature forms of defense mechanisms, which is expected and desirable in our psychosexual development. Now I will go a little towards the development of psychoanalysis and the International Psychoanalytical Society, the group of analysts which was happening, the Wednesday Society, which comprised Otto Rank, Carl Jung, Carl Abraham, Sandor Ferenczi, Eitingen, Ernst Jones. As we can see, that this gives us a clue that psychoanalysis was spreading across Hungary, America, Great Britain, Europe, of course. So in a way, the whole world was in the weave of it. And if we remember, 1922 is when the Indian Psychoanalytical Society was first formed, which means psychoanalysis as a discipline was already in discourse in the Indian scenario. So which means we'll be very soon coming into this picture. So this is how, more or less, one would say we can see that psychoanalysis as an institute or as a discipline, as a practiced discipline is evolving. And all of them, all six of them, have very, very significant individual contributions to the development of psychoanalysis and psychology. This was the first International Psychoanalytic Congress. This is because to share with all of you that the first Psychoanalytic Congress, starting in Salzburg in 1908, continues even till date. The last one happened in Boston. So it happens every alternate year. So people who are interested in psychoanalysis, there is a body, it's a mother body of the Psychoanalytic Association, which is situated in London. But all of us are regional societies, like we have the Indian Society, like we have other societies in America, England, Europe, other countries, Russia. Interesting to see that Freud, Jones, and Jung, all three of them, were working together towards the development of this science and towards, still working together towards development of an institute, a school of thought, developing an institute which would be gradually getting into all kinds of becoming a larger body for the entire global practice of psychoanalysis. It's a different matter that Carl Jung developed his own ideas and started independently later on, but we must see the significant contributions that all of them had, from Otto Rank to Jung, all of them. In 1910 in Nuremberg, the first IPA president was Jung. Interesting to see that Freud was neither the first president or the secretary, as a matter of fact, not even after that. I think that was an interesting observation, which we will find Ernest Jones writing in Life and Works of Freud. I think Freud was very clear that administrative role was not something that he could handle or was efficient enough, as much as probably in his writings and thoughts, or his engagement was much more with his thoughts and writings than with establishing an institute. And by the time he was quite a senior person, so he wanted the newer generation to be involved in it. Also, the second point is the International Psychoanalytic Journal, which still continues, started from that period. Andrea Salome, Marie Bonaparte, Helen Deutsch, Anna Freud. Helen Deutsch will be touching upon very briefly tomorrow. Anna Freud, of course. Karen Horney. Melanie Klein, yes, we'll be touching upon a little tomorrow as well. And Joan Riviere. So we find very, very powerful women, unlike the neurotic women that we try to believe and think of, you know, women as fragile, neurotic, a little hysteric, melodramatic, all of that. We find very, very strong women coming into the field of psychoanalysis, challenging theories of psychoanalysis, challenging Freud. I think what I love about Freud is that here was this person who was creating radical people around him and constantly having the confidence for other people to question him, to reject him, and never holding it against them. He went on doing his work and writing. I think that is something that I would like to focus on. Not about, and that's something that I would like to learn as a quality, as what Erickson would later on talk about, that at the fag end of your life, you want to leave behind something. I think I can so clearly see that in Freud, and I hope we have the capacity to cultivate that. That we see our younger ones, whom we have taught, are becoming much larger than us, challenging us, questioning us, rejecting us, but we have the generosity not to hold it against them, allowing them, giving them the freedom to develop their own thought processes, schools of thought, differ, criticize. A lot of them have been very, very critical of Freud. As a matter of fact, criticize Freud outwardly. That we have the generosity to contain all of that. Generosity, containment capacity, these are all things that we will be looking at tomorrow, which Freud has lived it in his work, sometimes touched upon in his writings, but post-Freudians have articulated it in a much more theoretical manner, as we will find in Winnicott when we talk about containing capacity. 1920, beyond the pleasure principle. Now, this period onwards, I think, for me, it is an interesting period because I think Freud gets ripened. He's moving more from the drive theory towards the ego gradually, because something was intriguing him, something was compelling him in his stomach to look at all the drive that was happening around him. The loss of his daughter, of course, Sophie, his first jaw operation, Anna Freud, who was his very favorite, was summoned to the conventions in 1925. And the growing unrest in Vienna of the Second World War setting in and about to kind of set in, the unrest between the wars and all of that. I think something was pushing him to question about all the drives which was happening, that somewhere mankind has to go beyond this drive. If we have to really look at civilization, we'll have to address going beyond the pleasure principle. So far, the ego seemed to have been always interested in solving conflicts in order to find satisfaction, fulfillment, and thereby deriving somewhat a pleasurable state of being. This is the period when gradually the shift is no longer about a fulfillment, but rather a withstanding of frustration for the ego. How my pleasure may not be possible to derive, and yet how can I sustain myself? So a look at trying to go beyond the pleasure principle, that to be human, I have to go beyond my immediate pleasures. To be human, I have to go beyond my immediate animal instinctual drives. It's a test like every day to prove that I'm human. And this was, I think, possibly happening with everything that was happening in his life at a personal level, at a global level. A questioning of the instinctual drives, that the instinct cannot have an overruling impact on civilization. There has to be something which goes beyond my instinct, and that's exactly what the ego psychology would be looking at post-Freud. How ego does not necessarily mean I'm talking about the self. Ego psychology does not necessarily mean later on what is going to evolve as self-psychology. It's like fantasy does not necessarily mean just my imagination. It talks about a certain state of mind. Ego talks about a certain state of mind where it is capable of going beyond the pleasure principle. It is aware of the pleasures. It experiences the need and the drive for the pleasure, but can go beyond the pleasure. Has that containing capacity to go beyond the pleasure, and thereby redefining humanity and civilization. Humanity and civilization in its complexity cannot be satisfied, cannot be complacent with its introduction and with its identification with the animal kingdom. Yes, we are only of the highest order of the animal kingdom, that's all. But we have the potential to become the lowest of the animal kingdom or go beyond the highest order of the animal kingdom. 1933, we find the book burning of Open Platz, where Freud's writings were burnt, and we will find very soon Freud trying to get away from Vienna to London, supported by his students and colleagues like Ernest Jones. Yes, I am not going to go into this. This is the theory that I was talking about, the instinctual theory of the eros and the thanatos. This eros is not the same eros and erotica of sexuality. This eros basically is talking about the life drive as opposed to thanatos, the death drive. Death drive is not necessarily just killing. Any negative imagination, a while back when I give my free association of stoning, is part of the death drive, the thanatos. The Future of an Illusion, 1927. Civilization, to raise itself above its animal status, civilization must be built up on renunciation of instinct. And this is most wonderful for a creator. One who started studying human beings through instincts. More than 50 years, half his life, he talked about instincts. And he comes to the end of his life and says that instinct needs to be renunciated for us to be human beings. I cannot go into the discourse of how we can do it. There he's written extensively, we can talk about it, but some other time. Compulsion to work. It might be difficult for us to believe that compulsion to work, it's how can that be possible? Usually nobody likes to work. You know, all of us would love to have adda and do no work. Contrary to that belief, if we observe children, if you let them play day in and day out, with no discipline, no work, they just can do whatever they want, play random, they'll be bored. They'll come back to you and look for something constructive. It's the same when later on, when you go on watching pornography, after a point you're bored. You want something richer than mundane fun and frolic. This is exactly what Freud was implying, compulsion to work. We have the innate compulsion to work. We are driven by the superficial, that I am pleasure driven. Civilization becomes civilized if we have the potential to look beyond this superficial, pleasure-driven individual, because we have it in our innate psychic structure, compulsion to work. A growing engagement with the ego development. This is the ego development. It's not the same as self. Self is still tangible. This is very abstract. This renunciation of instinct, this capacity to go beyond, and the compulsion to work. And these two become the final objective of psychoanalysis. I won't go into much detail of it, but perhaps today and tomorrow we'll find occasions either on dais or out of dais. We'll have occasion to discuss more about psychoanalysis and its process. But very briefly, this is how it works on. The free association, fantasy, and transference. Transference is all about how we are dealing with resistances. Resistances which are created by unconscious defense mechanisms. Now this is difficult for me to elaborate briefly. I'm already over time. I promised Srimoyi I'll wind up by 1:20 and I'm 1:22. The analysts are supposed to be very, very particular about time. That has been their training. Analyst interpretation, countertransference, though in the morning we've heard about countertransference, is a post-Freudian development and object relationship development. This is, of course, we can talk at length, but in today's psychoanalysis, it's impossible to give interpretation, absolutely impossible without countertransference. The transference, the psychoanalysis that happens across the world, which is under the IPA, the International Psychoanalytic Association, transference, countertransference is absolutely mandatory. Neutrality has changed in its perception and understanding. I would also like to say that we may tend to believe that object relationship was not in focus in Freud's works. I would say that he did not have the articulation, but he wouldn't have arrived at this kind of therapy where the analyst and the analysand are talking to each other, where transference develops, the entire concept of transference, which Freud developed. Countertransference may come a little after Freud, but transference was very much something that Freud was working on. This couldn't have been possible without an object relationship happening and that kind of, its dynamics working on both the individuals. The aim of psychoanalysis, capacity to love, capacity to work. This capacity to love does not mean only romantic love. This capacity to love is implying to the love that we talked about when we talked about ego just a while back. That to be able to love beyond to be able to be a human being beyond my immediate pleasure. That this may not give me any pleasure, my direct pleasure, but this has the potential of a larger, quote-unquote, good. Love which is good and healthy will always thrive us. Love which confines us cannot be love. And when we are in love, and when we feel loved, and when we dwell in love, we nurture love. We nurture work and love together. Capacity to work. This doesn't mean capacity to earn money. Earn money has nothing to do with work. That is only incidental. That's not even the concern. Capacity to work in every capacity. In whatever you want to work in. Something that engages you completely. Whether it's farming, whether it's gardening, whether it's writing like Freud, whether it's painting, whether it's being a star like Shah Rukh Khan. You're not driven by the reward, you're driven by the work. And that's the only way that we can return to civilization. I would like to end today's lecture with a quotation from Freud in Future of an Illusion. We may insist as often as we like that man's intellect is powerless in comparison to his instinctual life. This is 1927 he's writing. And we may be right in this. Nevertheless, there is something peculiar about this weakness. The voice of the intellect is a soft one, but it will not rest until it has gained a hearing. Finally, and after a countless succession of rebuffs, it succeeds. And I'm hoping that psychoanalysis will succeed in Calcutta after it has gone through a certain phase of, I don't know, rebuff or silence or absence. And now, let us to take the couch. I would love to do that. I would like to have my free association. Thank you very much, everyone, for bearing with me for 1.5 hours. Thank you.